I recently published Typica version 1.7, and this has some changes that might be a little bit confusing at first. There are some new features where it might not be immediately obvious how to use those effectively, so I thought I'd make this video tour of some of those changes and offer some suggestions. Opening Typica, I've previously told this to forget about my database connection, so it's asking for that. Two changes here. First, you can change the port number. Previously, you could only connect to a database running on port 5432, which is the Postgres default. The other is that the default button is now Connect. I'm recording this on a Mac, so that's obvious, but on some other platforms, the style difference is really subtle and people would type in the connection info, hit enter, and that would activate the cancel button, which you use to not connect to a database, and most of the features don't work without a database. I'm glad that's fixed. It's important to note that I'm recording this at home and I'm not connecting to my production database at work. So when I start opening up different windows, there's old data, there's data that just exists for testing. This video is more about workflows and capabilities, and the data is just there to demonstrate that, so don't pay too much attention to that. It's not important. This is one of the nice things about having control over your own data. I can set up testing environments, do demos, and mess around with things without having to worry about screwing up production data. That's not always as easy to do with some competing systems. So, the database is on the same computer I'm using, but it could be on another machine on the local network. It could be on a machine out on the internet. Typica doesn't care where the database is. Same as always. There are a couple of things you might notice right away on this main navigation window. First, there are a couple buttons missing, the invoice list and the batch log buttons. The features aren't gone, but they have been redesigned and moved to the reports menu. Invoices is under purchase. Batch log is under production. I'll go ahead and open the batch log now. If you've used an older version of Typica, this looks a lot different. There's more information on each batch, which takes more screen space, so there are fewer batches for a given area. If I scroll down to the bottom, there's some aggregate info on the displayed batches. There are also some controls at the top of the window. You can set a range of dates of batches that you're interested in. Most of the time, you probably don't really care about batches you roasted 8 years ago, so no sense in accessing that data. Though if you want everything, that's still an option. You can filter on batch type, so maybe you only care about production roasts and you don't need to see the details of how you did pre-purchase sample roasting, or the other way around. You can filter on approval, that little checkbox in the new batch window. Skipping to the end, you can show weight information in pounds or kilograms. And then there's that box labeled search. Let's do some examples of how those might be useful. I'll go back to the navigation window, hit roast coffee. Since I'm at home and not connected to a coffee roaster, this looks pretty boring, but I can open a new batch window. When a new lot of coffee comes in, I roast some test batches, as you may have seen in some of my other videos. I have a roasted coffee item called sample that I use for that. I can select my green coffee, put in the weight of the test batch. I'll roast that, pull a lot of cups, marking when each was pulled. For a batch like this, the roasted weight is meaningless, so I'll leave that as 0, and I'll uncheck the approved box since this isn't something that I'm going to sell. I might put in notes on how I marked my samples if I'm doing this with more than one coffee, just to make it easier to find that batch later. And I'll hit submit to save the batch to the database. Then I might have a full day of roasting, so by the time I get around to evaluating those product development roasts, the batch might be pretty far down the batch log. So let's say I've cupped the coffee, I found something that I want to replicate. The next thing to do is try doing a production roast to match that cup. So I'll select a proper roasted coffee item and select my green coffee, put in the weight, and I'll hit no profile since I want to make sure I'm associating the roast with this data and I don't have my new roasting plan associated with this roasted coffee item. Now I could go to the batch menu and load additional profiles to open the batch log, but since I already have that open, I'll just click over to that. I know that I didn't approve the batch that I'm looking for, so I can just change the approval filter to not approved, and I see nothing because my data is old and I have this set to only show batches roasted in the last 7 days. I can change that to something longer, and I get some data. Yes. Alternately, I know that my roasted coffee item is sample, so I can just type that into the search box, and there's that. My sample item is item 100. On this database, if you set this up, it is likely to be something different, but here I type that in, I get the same thing, and maybe I'm looking for a roast like this that used Colombian coffee. So I can type in that, and I can see my unapproved batches that used that green coffee. So there's my batch, and I can click one of these links. It doesn't matter which. And I can look at that data and say, okay, that's the batch I want. I'll load that as a target profile. And I'll replicate that up to the point of the cup that I'm interested in. And when I'm done, I can enter the roasted coffee weight and tentatively save that as a target profile so that the roasting data shows up every time I want to roast another batch of that coffee. So start, stop, I would put in the real roasted weight, tentatively approve that, save as target profile, and send it to the database. Going back to the batch log, you may have noticed that there's this file number. Some roasters use that as a batch identifier, so maybe a customer brings up a bag of coffee and says it's darker than what it usually is. You can get that number off the bag. Let's say that is 9460. We'll type that in, and there's my batch. So this batch had a weight loss of 19.89%. Seems high. What is that number usually? Well, I can see that it's this Sumatra Mutu Batak, or however that's pronounced, I'm not sure. Type that in, and I could have just written Sumatra there, but then I'd get decaf mixed in as well. So the more specific search term you can get, the nicer that is to work with the results. So I'm seeing 18.19, 18.49. Scrolling, I get 18.6, 18.25, 18.24. So yes, that 19.89% batch probably does seem too dark. If only there were some way to record what we expect for weight loss, this could have been caught before it went to the customer. Well, there is a way to do that. If I go back to the navigation window, I can see that I didn't just remove buttons, I also put a new one in. This edit roasting specification. So I have this filled in for this Ethiopian coffee. And here I can see that for this coffee I expect the weight loss of 14.46%, plus or minus 0.5%. So how did I decide on that? Well, I roasted some batches, and if I go to the batch log, I can search for those. It's Yurgz, 0 defect, shipped in Grain Pro, and if I scroll down and look at weight loss, it's very consistent. Scrolling back up, there's a batch that was roasted after the spec was set. Weight loss was 14.57%. That's within 0.1%, but it's important to note that my scale only goes out to 0.1 of a pound. For this batch, I could not possibly have gotten closer to the expected weight loss without buying a more precise scale. So it's important to have a realistic tolerance here. Since the weight loss is within the expected range that's shown in green, if it were out of range that would be red, and I could mouse over the number to see what the expected weight loss was. Going back to the roasting specification, there's also a notes section. Percent weight loss is a good start, but that's not enough to ensure that the coffee will taste right. The specification notes is where you can type up anything that would be useful to see either before or after roasting a batch. For example, if you had a coffee that needs to be roasted with a smaller batch size, maybe that's needed for better control or a faster cooling time, that could go in and it would show up in the new batch window as soon as the roasted coffee item is selected. In Typica 1.6.4, I added new timers that can be used to measure the duration of different temperature ranges. If that's set up, the details would go into the annotation of the new batch window, so it's easy to compare with the spec. In the batch log, at the end of each record shows notes from the batch on the left and specification notes on the right. Maybe you have other tools like color tiles or roast development meters. In general, if it's something that can be checked at the roaster, that can go into the specification notes, but I'd caution against being too verbose here. Keep the type of information displayed consistent and keep it short, otherwise people are just going to ignore those notes. Back in the new batch window, I can select my coffee. I've roasted this before, so the green coffee shows up and I can see just how much the database thinks is currently in my inventory. Maybe I want a 40-pound batch, so I can enter that. And the remaining column updates to show how much coffee will be left after roasting that. On the right, I can see my expected percent weight loss, but I can also see the range of what I'm expecting for roasted coffee weight. So here, I'm expecting somewhere between 34.02 and 34.42 pounds of roasted coffee. I check my specification notes. I don't see anything special. So I hit load profile and I get a warning. My roaster has a maximum capacity of 30 pounds. So it's warning me that I've put in more and that I probably don't really want to do that. So I can cancel and maybe do this as a couple of 20-pound batches instead. So I could have clicked through there and done an overloaded batch. Typica would complain again before sending the information on that batch to the database. Maybe you're roasting coffee for a class on roasting defects and you really do want a terrible roast. But where did this warning come from? If I go to Configure Roasters and select the roaster I'm using, there's a new checkbox that can be checked to have Typica test if a batch is entered that exceeds a specified capacity. I can change the unit on that to something else if I want, and that can be set differently for every machine. Earlier, I mentioned the invoice list. I can open that up, and here, again, I can filter on date range, same as in the batch log. I can filter on vendor, and there's another search box. So maybe I need to know how much fair trade certified coffee I purchased in 2015. So I can change the date range to show last year. I can see that's all of last year. And that's a lot of invoices. I don't really want to check on all of those because I know that I don't have fair trade coffee from all of those suppliers. But if I search for fair trade, I have far fewer invoices to check to meet my reporting requirements, as long as I entered that data appropriately. Another thing that I like to do when roasting coffee is once I've sent the last batch of roasted from a bag of coffee, I'll do an inventory adjustment to the number of bags remaining. Doing this, I can see from the new batch window the next time I roast that coffee that I have a whole number of bags left, and I probably need to haul another bag out from the back room. This window got a new feature. I can change the transaction type to loss. Maybe I was about to roast a batch of coffee and instead of pouring that coffee into the hopper, I poured it onto the floor. Terrible depth perception. I already had the weight, so I can type that, and there's a reason box that I can use to put in why I'm reducing the inventory by that amount. If I look at my inventory change summary, I can click through to the item transactions. You can pull that report up directly, but then this list of coffees can become unreasonable to find the item of interest. That loss transaction shows up here, and that can let you see what issues have resulted in lost coffee, how common those are, and you can start thinking about solutions since you don't want to waste coffee. Another new thing is this reminders report. This is for anything that you want to remind yourself to do, where how often that needs to be done depends on what you're roasting. I can create a new reminder, give it a name, I can put in any notes that I want to associate with that. Maybe that's details about how to do the task. Maybe it's info on the last time it was done. Whatever you're going to find useful for that particular thing. And I can decide if this is based on how much coffee I've roasted, the number of batches roasted, the number of hours that I've had coffee in the roaster, or I can just do straight number of days without really looking at the production data at all. And I can set when it's looking for. So maybe I want to do this every 1,000 pounds of coffee that I've roasted, and I did that on, say, the 13th. I can just save that, and you can see that it knows to count from that time. I can open that up. Maybe I did the thing early, and now I want to do that again in the next 1,000 pounds. I can really easily set the current time by hitting now and save, and we can see now that that's going to show based on that initial 1,000 pound condition. Or maybe I am done doing this, I don't need to do it again, I can just delete that and it goes away. There are a lot of changes in the older reports, but one I use a lot is recent average coffee production. I use this to help me decide how much of each coffee I want to roast. I'll go to the shelf, see what I need to fill that, look at orders, split out blends, then subtract anything that I've already roasted that could be bagged. Whatever is left is what I need, but there's a balance to consider. Ideally, you'd just always roast full capacity batches. It takes the same amount of time to roast a large batch as it does to roast a small one, and you're hopefully paying the person roasting the coffee the same, so the cost of labor per pound goes down as the batch size goes up. But I'd rather sell fresh coffee than stale coffee, so for less popular coffees, it might be better to roast smaller batches. If I want to roast every coffee about once per week, it might be good to see how much I've roasted recently, and that's why this report was originally written. I found that looking at the last 4 weeks, these numbers changed quickly enough, both as an item is becoming more popular and as it becomes less popular. What's new here is some controls to determine how far back to look at roasting data and how many days to scale production out by. That can be particularly helpful when dealing with large seasonal changes. For example, if my coffee sales double in December, I might change days to scale to 14, which effectively doubles the numbers in the report, and I can back that number down as I go farther into the month. Then, when sales return to normal, I might want to increase the days to average so that the data isn't all coming from when production was high. You might also change those settings if you have different freshness goals or different sales patterns. It's important to note that this isn't telling me that I must roast a certain amount of coffee. It's just providing another way of looking at production data that's useful to consider when making that decision. And I think that's a good note to end this on. Nothing in Typica should be considered as something that makes decisions for you. You still need to decide what to buy, when, how much, at what price, how to roast it, how much to roast, when, and that's going to be based on what kind of business you want and what your customers will support. Keeping good records and being able to quickly find and analyze data relevant to those decisions can help you make better decisions more quickly. I hope you find Typica useful for that, but please remember that these decisions are yours to make and not the responsibility of some tool. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. If it's something that I think more people should be interested in, I might turn that into a new video. Check out my channel for more videos on Typica, coffee roasting, and more. If you want to see new videos as those are released, you can subscribe to that. If you found this video to be helpful, go ahead and like it and share it with others who might also find it useful. There's one more thing on the channel that I want to draw attention to, and that's the blue support button on the right. If you're finding Typica or my videos useful and want to see more work on both of those, I hope you'll consider supporting that work financially. It's really easy to do. And thanks for watching.